Victoria Hayes gripped the leather armrest of seat 2A until her knuckles turned bone white, her entire body rigid with exhaustion and shame. For 4 unbearable hours, 240 minutes that felt like lifetimes, her 7-month-old daughter Emma had screamed as if the world itself was ending, each shriek piercing through the first-class cabin like shattered glass. Victoria, CEO of a $6 billion pharmaceutical company, a woman who commanded boardrooms filled with the most powerful executives in America, sat utterly helpless. Around her, hostile stares multiplied, whispers cut deeper than knives. An elderly woman 2 rows back made no effort to hide her disgust. A businessman typed furiously on his laptop, each keystroke an accusation. Then something happened that would change everything. A tall black man rose from premium economy, a purple heart patch visible on his worn backpack. As he walked toward her crying baby, Victoria's first instinct, the one she would hate herself for later, was fear. She had no idea this stranger would reveal a connection that defied all logic, all coincidence, all reason. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Victoria Hayes had built her empire on control. At 44, she commanded Hayes Pharmaceuticals with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a general. $6 billion in annual revenue, 500 employees across 3 continents, a pipeline of cancer drugs that could save millions of lives. She had negotiated with the FDA, stared down hostile boards, and rebuilt her late father's failing company into a pharmaceutical powerhouse. But none of that mattered now. 8 months ago, her husband Michael had walked out their front door after the worst fight of their marriage. Victoria's last words to him still echoed in her skull like a death sentence. Maybe Emma would be better off without a father too weak to support his wife's ambitions. 15 minutes later, a drunk driver ran a red light. Michael died before the ambulance arrived. 6 weeks after his funeral, Emma was born. Victoria had gone into labor alone, gripping the hospital bed rails while Michael's empty chair mocked her from the corner. She'd deleted his final voicemail without listening to it. Couldn't bear to hear his voice saying words she'd never be able to answer. For 8 months, she'd kept his closet exactly as he'd left it, his cologne bottle half empty on the dresser. At night, she slept on the couch because their bed felt like a grave. Work became her morphine. Mergers, acquisitions, clinical trials, anything to avoid the crushing weight of guilt. This San Francisco trip was crucial, an FDA approval meeting that could determine whether her company's breakthrough cancer drug reached the market. 500 jobs depended on this approval. Thousands of patients needed this medication, but her nanny had called in sick at the last minute, and Victoria found herself on a cross-country flight with a screaming infant and no idea how to comfort her own daughter. Around her, first-class passengers radiated hostility. The elderly Asian woman across the aisle, Margaret, something kept glancing over with thinly veiled disapproval. A businessman in seat 3B typed aggressively on his laptop, each keystroke punctuating his irritation. Even the flight attendant's professional smile had begun to crack after 4 hours of relentless crying. Victoria had tried everything: bottles, diaper changes, walking the aisles until her legs ached. Nothing worked. Emma's face was purple with distress, her tiny body rigid with pain. Victoria couldn't identify or relieve. She was failing. At motherhood. At the one thing that should have come naturally. Michael would have known what to do. Michael had read every parenting book, attended every prenatal class while Victoria buried herself in quarterly reports. Now he was gone, and Victoria was drowning. 3 rows behind Victoria's crisis. Marcus Washington sat with his eyes closed, breathing in careful counts of 4, 7, 8. 4 seconds in, 7 seconds hold, 8 seconds out. The technique his VA therapist had taught him for managing panic attacks. Emma's screams triggered something deep in his chest. Not the violent sounds of war, but something softer and infinitely more painful. The memory of children crying in a field hospital in Kandahar, where he'd held Afghan babies while their mothers received treatment for injuries he tried not to think about. The sound of his infant nephew crying through withdrawal because Marcus's sister had used drugs during pregnancy. And Marcus had spent endless nights walking that tiny, suffering child, searching for any technique that might bring relief. Marcus Washington was 24 years old and carried more scars than most men twice his age. 6 years in the Army, 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat medic, a Purple Heart. He never wore because it reminded him of the explosion that earned it, and the 7-year-old Afghan boy he couldn't save despite doing everything right, following every protocol, performing CPR until his arms gave out and his hands were raw. 3 months ago, he'd been stopped by police while walking home from his night shift at Baltimore General Hospital. White officer, hand on weapon, voice sharp with suspicion. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Marcus had lived there for 2 years. He'd shown his military ID, his VA card, his Johns Hopkins nursing program interview letter, his hospital badge. The officer had kept him spread-eagled against a wall for 20 minutes anyway, waiting for backup. "Just making sure you're who you say you are." Marcus had learned the hard way in Afghanistan. Visibility meant death. In America, visibility meant suspicion. So he'd learned to make himself invisible. Head down, voice quiet, movement slow and non-threatening. Never make eye contact too long. Never reach for anything suddenly. Always keep your hands where they can see them. He'd boarded this flight to Boston for the most important interview of his life. Johns Hopkins School of Nursing, one of the best in the country. A full scholarship if he impressed them. A chance to escape Baltimore's cycle of poverty and violence that had already claimed his father, 2 uncles, and his best friend from high school. But Hopkins felt like a fantasy. Marcus was a community college student with a worn backpack held together with duct tape, flying on upgraded VA benefits because he couldn't afford regular economy. Around him sat people who belonged in this world, people with expensive luggage and casual confidence, people who'd never had a police officer's knee in their back for the crime of existing in the wrong neighborhood. When Emma's crying had started an hour into the flight, Marcus had barely noticed. Babies cried. That was normal. But as the first hour became the second, then the third, then the fourth, Marcus's medic training began cataloging symptoms against his will. The pitch of Emma's screams, the way she pulled her legs up toward her chest, the desperate, pain-soaked quality that went beyond ordinary fussiness. He recognized that cry. Ear infection, probably severe. Combined with colic, the cabin pressure was likely causing excruciating pain. He'd treated dozens of children with similar symptoms in Kandahar, had learned techniques from Afghan mothers that Western medicine didn't teach. Specific holding positions that relieved pressure on inflamed eustachian tubes. Gentle massage on lymph nodes to reduce swelling. Low-frequency sounds that somehow soothed distressed infants when nothing else worked. He could help. He knew he could help. For 2 hours. Marcus wrestled with the decision. He pulled out his nursing textbooks, tried to focus on the material he needed to master for tomorrow's interview. But concentration was impossible with Emma's increasingly desperate cries echoing through the cabin. Each scream felt like an accusation. You have the skills to help, and you're choosing not to. But walking forward meant making himself visible. A young black man approaching a wealthy white woman in first class. Reaching for her baby. Marcus had seen that scenario play out in his mind 1,000 times, and it never ended well. Best case, rejection and humiliation. Worst case, someone calls security. Police meet the plane, and his Johns Hopkins interview becomes a police incident report. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. She'd raised him after his father died. Had taught him the spirituals her own grandmother learned from people who'd survived slavery. "Baby," she told him when he enlisted, "this world's gonna try to make you small. Gonna try to convince you that your black skin is a threat instead of a crown. But you listen to me, you got healer's blood in your veins. Your great-great-grandfather was a root doctor who helped people in secret when slavery said he had no right to knowledge. You got that same gift. When you see somebody hurting, you help them, even if helping makes you visible. Even if visible gets you hurt. Because that's what it means to be free, choosing compassion, even when silence is safer." Emma's cry changed. Marcus's head snapped up. That pitch, that specific desperate pitch, meant she was approaching the kind of pain threshold where eardrums could rupture. He'd heard it before, from a little girl in Kandahar whose eardrum had ruptured from blast trauma. If Emma's eardrum burst at this altitude, the consequences could be severe. Marcus closed his textbook. His hands were shaking as he unbuckled his seatbelt. Around him, passengers noticed his movement. A middle-aged white man shifted in his seat, hand moving toward his phone. Marcus felt their eyes on him, calculating, suspicious, already writing the narrative of threat. He stood up anyway, started walking toward first class. Each step felt like walking toward enemy fire. The flight attendant stationed at the divider between economy and first class looked at him with polite suspicion. She was a black woman in her 30s. Which meant she understood the mathematics of what Marcus was attempting. Her eyes said, "Be careful. This could go very wrong for you. Can I help you with something?" Her tone was professionally neutral, but her body language blocked his path. Marcus kept his voice calm, respectful, unthreatening. "Ma'am," the baby crying in first class, "I'm a medic, military trained, 6 years Army service, currently in nursing school. I recognize the type of crying. I think the baby might have a severe ear infection, and I might be able to help with some techniques I learned in field hospitals." The flight attendant studied him. Marcus could see her mental calculation help a suffering baby versus the risk of a black man approaching a white woman. In 2024, that calculation still didn't automatically favor compassion. "What's your name?" she asked. "Marcus Washington, ma'am." He pulled out his military ID, his VA card, his nursing school identification. "I did 2 tours in Afghanistan. I have experience treating pediatric patients in combat zones. I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just think I might be able to help that baby." Something in his eyes, or his voice, or the careful way he held his credentials, shifted her expression. "Wait here," she said. She disappeared into first class. Marcus stood in the galley, hyper-aware of passengers watching him. His heart hammered against his ribs. The man with the phone was definitely recording now. Marcus kept his hands visible, his posture open, his expression calm. Everything in his training screamed, "Make yourself non-threatening." Your life depends on how safe you make other people feel, after what felt like hours, but was probably 90 seconds. The flight attendant returned. Behind her came a woman who looked like she was drowning, blonde hair disheveled, expensive blouse stained, exhaustion carved into every line of her face. She carried a red-faced, screaming baby whose distress was visible even from 15 feet away. "You're the medic?" Victoria Hayes asked. Her voice was sharp with desperation and doubt. Her eyes swept over Marcus, taking in his worn clothes, his patched backpack, his skin color. He saw the flash of fear before she could hide it. That flash of fear cut deeper than any knife Marcus had felt in Afghanistan. But he'd expected it, had prepared for it, had lived with it his entire life. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "My name is Marcus Washington. I'm an Army medic, served 6 years, including 2 tours in Afghanistan. I'm currently in my final year of nursing school. I don't mean to intrude, but I recognize your daughter's cry. I think she might have a severe ear infection combined with colic, and the cabin pressure is making it significantly worse. I learned some techniques treating children in field hospitals that might provide temporary relief until you can get her proper medical care." Victoria stared at him. Her daughter screamed, and for a moment that stretched like eternity. Marcus didn't know which way this would go, toward help or toward humiliation. "Absolutely not." The voice cut through the cabin like a whip crack. An elderly Asian woman across the aisle, Margaret Chen, though Marcus didn't know her name yet, half rose from her seat. Her face flushed with indignation. "Young lady, you cannot just hand your baby to a complete stranger." Victoria's arms tightened protectively around Emma, but Marcus saw the exhaustion warring with maternal instinct in her eyes. He stayed perfectly still, hands visible at his sides, making no move toward the baby or the mother. "Ma'am, I completely understand your concern," Marcus said, his voice calm and professional despite his racing heart. "I can provide additional identification, my commanding officer's contact information, references from Baltimore General Hospital where I work, my nursing school dean's number. I'm not asking Mrs." He paused, realizing he didn't know her name. "Hayes," Victoria said quietly. "Victoria Hayes. I'm not asking Mrs. Hayes to trust me blindly," Marcus continued, keeping his tone steady. "I'm offering to demonstrate the technique first, explain exactly what I'm doing and why, and she maintains full control over her daughter the entire time. If at any point she's uncomfortable, I'll step back immediately." Margaret Chen's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't care about your credentials or your explanations. It's simply not appropriate for—" She caught herself, but everyone heard what she hadn't said. The unfinished sentence hung in the air like smoke. Jessica, the flight attendant, stepped forward. Her voice was quiet, but carried steel underneath. "Mrs. Chen, what exactly isn't appropriate? A trained medical professional offering to help a suffering child. The cabin went silent. Even Emma's screaming seemed to pause for a heartbeat, as passengers realized they were witnessing something that went beyond a crying baby. This was about something deeper, something most people preferred to ignore until it stared them directly in the face. "I just think," Margaret began, but Jessica cut her off. "With respect, ma'am, I think we all know exactly what you think." Jessica turned to Victoria. "Mrs. Hayes, Mr. Washington served 6 years in the U.S. Army. He has a Purple Heart. He's currently in nursing school with an excellent academic record. I checked with my supervisor while he was waiting. The decision is entirely yours. But his credentials are legitimate." Victoria looked at Marcus. Really looked at him this time, not at his skin color or his worn clothes or the assumptions that had flashed through her mind when he first approached. She looked at his eyes, which were steady and kind despite the humiliation he'd just endured. She looked at his hands, which were calloused but clean, the hands of someone who worked with his body as well as his mind. She looked at the Purple Heart patch on his backpack and thought about what that meant about pain and sacrifice and choosing to serve people who might never see him as fully human. And she looked at Emma, whose face was purple with pain, whose tiny body was rigid with suffering. Victoria couldn't identify or relieve despite all her wealth and power and education. "What do you need me to do?" Victoria asked. Relief flickered across Marcus's face, but he remained professional. "First, may I examine her ears? I have a pen light. I'm going to reach into my pocket slowly to retrieve it." He moved with deliberate care, pulling out a small medical pen light. A woman 2 rows back gasped slightly at the movement, and Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Even now, even offering help. His movements had to be choreographed to avoid triggering fear. "I'll hold her," Victoria said. "You can look, but I'll hold her." "Of course, ma'am." Marcus knelt in the first-class aisle, putting himself physically lower than Victoria's submissive posture, non-threatening. He'd learned these survival tactics long before the Army formalized them as combat zone protocols for winning hearts and minds. He gently turned Emma's head, shining the penlight into her left ear. The baby's screams intensified. Marcus's jaw tightened. "Her left eardrum is severely inflamed and bulging. That's causing significant pain, and the cabin pressure is making it exponentially worse. Her right ear shows early signs of infection, too." He looked up at Victoria. "Has she been unusually fussy for the past few days? Pulling at her ears, trouble sleeping?" Victoria felt her stomach drop. "Yes. The nanny said she'd been difficult this week, but I thought she was just being fussy because I'd been working late." The guilt in her voice was palpable. "Ear infections in infants can develop quickly," Marcus said. "This isn't your fault, but she needs relief soon, or her eardrum could rupture." "What can you do?" Victoria's voice cracked. Marcus explained carefully, making sure Victoria understood every step. "There are specific pressure points along an infant's neck and jaw that can help drain fluid from the eustachian tubes. Combined with a particular holding position that relieves pressure on the inner ear, it can provide temporary relief. I learned this from Afghan mothers in Kandahar. Their traditional medicine sometimes works better than Western techniques for this specific situation." He demonstrated the holding position without touching Emma, showing how the baby's head would be elevated at a specific angle, how gentle pressure would be applied along her spine and neck. "The key is reducing the pressure differential between her inner ear and the cabin," I'll also use a low-frequency humming sound. It sounds strange, but the vibration can help." Victoria looked at her screaming daughter, at this stranger who'd walked through a gauntlet of suspicion to offer help, at Margaret Chen's disapproving face, at the other passengers watching this drama unfold. She made a decision that 8 months of grief had nearly stolen from her. She chose to trust. "Show me," she said. Marcus's hands moved with practiced gentleness as he guided Victoria in transferring Emma to the specific position. The moment his hands made contact with the baby, something shifted. Perhaps it was his absolute confidence, or the gentle firmness of someone who'd held hundreds of injured children, or some ineffable quality that suffering humans recognize in their healers. Emma's screaming didn't stop immediately, but it changed pitch from desperate agony to something closer to confused distress. Marcus began applying pressure to specific points along Emma's tiny spine, his fingers moving with the precision of someone who'd performed these motions countless times. And then he started humming low, rhythmic, a melody that sounded ancient. "Wade in the water," he hummed softly. "Wade in the water, children." The spiritual his grandmother had taught him, the song enslaved people had used to pass coded messages about escape routes, disguised as religious music. Wade in the water meant escape through streams so dogs couldn't track your scent. His ancestors had survived by hiding messages in plain sight, by being invisible when they needed to survive and visible when someone needed saving. Now, at 35,000 feet, Marcus sang the song his people had used to guide each other to freedom, and a white baby descendant of the very people who had enslaved his ancestors found comfort in that melody. The cabin held its collective breath. Emma's screaming reduced to whimpering. Her rigid body began to relax. Her tiny fists, which had been clenched in pain, slowly uncurled. And then her eyes, Michael's eyes, Victoria thought with a sharp pang, opened and focused on Marcus's face. For the first time in 4 hours, Emma looked peaceful, almost curious. She studied Marcus's face with the intense concentration only babies possess, as if trying to memorize the features of the person who'd made her pain stop. Marcus continued the gentle massage, continued humming, his movements patient and sure. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Emma's whimpering faded to occasional hiccups. Her breathing deepened and steadied. "The pressure's equalizing," Marcus said quietly. "The inflammation won't go away without antibiotics, but this should give her significant relief for the rest of the flight. You'll need to see a pediatrician as soon as you land. This is serious enough that she might need prescription eardrops in addition to oral antibiotics." Victoria couldn't speak. Tears streamed down her face, not from embarrassment anymore, but from overwhelming relief and gratitude and the sudden, crushing weight of 8 months of held grief finally beginning to crack open. Emma reached up with one tiny hand and touched Marcus's face, and then, impossibly, she smiled. The cabin erupted in spontaneous applause. The applause rippled through the cabin like a wave, starting with the elderly Vietnam veteran 3 rows back who stood up, his weathered face creased with emotion. "Thank you for your service, son," he called out, his voice rough. Other passengers joined in scattered clapping that grew into something more, something that felt like collective relief and gratitude and perhaps shame for their earlier suspicion. Marcus carefully transferred Emma back to Victoria's arms, maintaining the same supportive position. "Keep her elevated like this for at least another 30 minutes," he instructed. "And try to keep her calm. Any agitation will increase the pressure again." Victoria cradled her daughter, who had settled into peaceful drowsiness for the first time in hours, one tiny hand still reaching toward Marcus, as if reluctant to break contact. "I don't know how to thank you," Victoria whispered. "I don't even know where to begin." "No thanks necessary, ma'am." Marcus started to stand, to return to his economy seat and the anonymity he'd sacrificed by walking forward. "Wait." Victoria's voice stopped him. She looked at the empty first-class seat beside her, the seat she'd booked for the nanny who'd never shown up. "Please, sit. She struggled for words. "I need to apologize to you." Marcus hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to make himself invisible again, to not push his luck by remaining in first class where he clearly didn't belong. But something in Victoria's face, raw grief mixed with desperate gratitude, made him slowly sink into the seat. "You don't need to apologize. Mrs. Hayes, you were protecting your daughter." "I was being a coward," Victoria said bluntly. Emma stirred slightly in her arms, and she automatically adjusted to the position Marcus had shown her. "When I first saw you walking toward us, my first thought wasn't about your credentials or your offer to help. My first thought was fear. And that fear had nothing to do with you and everything to do with—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "With my skin color," Marcus finished quietly. No judgment in his voice, just acknowledgment of a truth they both recognized. Victoria's face flushed with shame. "I marched in college, after Trayvon Martin, after Ferguson, after George Floyd. I put signs in my yard and attended protests and thought I was one of the good ones." She laughed bitterly. "But when it mattered, when a black man approached my baby, my first instinct was suspicion. I'm so deeply ashamed." "Don't be ashamed," Marcus said gently. "Just be better. That's all any of us can do." Across the aisle, Margaret Chen had been listening. The 72-year-old woman sat rigid in her seat, her hands clutched together in her lap, her face ashen. She'd grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, during the Civil Rights era. She'd watched the marches from her safe white neighborhood, feeling superior because she wasn't actively participating in the violence. She'd told herself for 60 years that she wasn't racist, that she'd evolved, that she judged people by the content of their character. But the words that had almost escaped her mouth 15 minutes ago, "It's simply not appropriate for a black man to," had shattered that comfortable self-image. She'd caught herself, but not before everyone heard what she'd been about to say. Now, watching Marcus Washington's gentle competence and grace under humiliation, Margaret felt physically ill. Her heart hammered in her chest. Her hands trembled, because she finally understood something she'd spent 72 years denying. Silence was participation. Assumptions were participation. And she'd just participated in the same racism she'd spent decades congratulating herself for transcending. Several rows behind them, James Patterson, CEO of a tech company worth $3 billion, typed furiously on his laptop, composing an email to his son. Jordan was a junior at Johns Hopkins, studying pre-med. James had donated $2 million to the school last year, ensuring Jordan's admission despite mediocre grades. Now he watched this young black man, this nursing student who'd walked through suspicion and fear to help a suffering child, and felt something uncomfortable twist in his gut. His company had recently settled a discrimination lawsuit. $4 million paid to make the problem go away, plus mandatory diversity training that James had mostly ignored. The lawsuit had alleged systematic bias in hiring and promotion, specifically against black candidates. James had dismissed it as frivolous, as people playing the race card to extort successful companies. But watching Marcus now, James wondered how many qualified people like him his company had passed over. How many resumes had been discarded because of assumptions about names or neighborhoods or schools that didn't carry Ivy League prestige? Victoria was studying Marcus's face, noting details she'd missed in her initial fear. The exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, not the exhaustion of one sleepless night, but the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been tired for a very long time. The careful way he held himself, even sitting down posture that suggested constant vigilance, the purple heart patch on his backpack, and the less visible scars that came with it. "How did you learn to do that?" Victoria asked, adjusting Emma as the baby's breathing deepened into sleep. That technique with the pressure points and the humming, where did that come from? Marcus's expression shifted, became distant. Kandahar. Mostly, I was a combat medic for 6 years, 2 tours in Afghanistan. We treated a lot of civilian casualties, including children. The Afghan mothers taught me techniques their grandmothers had taught them. Traditional medicine that's been passed down for generations. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Western medicine is excellent at treating acute trauma gunshot wounds, blast injuries, things that require surgical intervention, but for chronic pain management, for helping children cope with conditions when you don't have access to proper medications or equipment, sometimes the old ways work better. "And the song?" Victoria asked softly. "That was beautiful. What was it?" "Wade in the water," Marcus said. "It's a spiritual my grandmother taught me. Most people know it as a religious song about baptism. But it had another meaning during slavery times." He watched Victoria's face to see if she wanted him to continue. "Tell me," she said. It was a coded message. Marcus explained. Instructions hidden in plain sight. Wade in the water meant escape through streams and rivers so the dogs couldn't track your scent. The song gave directions to freedom disguised as worship. My ancestors survived by being invisible when they needed to survive, and visible when someone needed saving. The weight of that history settled over them. Here, in this first-class cabin, a descendant of enslaved people had sung a song about survival and freedom to comfort a white baby. And in that moment, something ancient and broken began, tentatively, to heal. Emma sighed in her sleep and snuggled closer to Victoria's chest. Completely peaceful now. Her tiny hand had finally released its grip on Victoria's collar and lay relaxed against her mother's arm. "I have another confession," Victoria said quietly. "When you first approached, part of me was afraid. But there was another part, a part I'm even more ashamed of, that was angry. Angry that a stranger could comfort my daughter when I couldn't. Angry that you made it look so easy when I'd been failing for 4 hours." She looked down at Emma's sleeping face. Her father died 8 months ago. Car accident. Emma was born 6 weeks after his funeral. And I've been so terrified that I'm failing her, that I don't have the natural maternal instinct, that I'm too broken by grief to be the mother she needs. Marcus listened without interrupting, recognizing the sound of someone who needed to be heard more than advised. Michael, my husband, he would have known what to do, Victoria continued, her voice breaking. He read all the parenting books. He was the one who wanted to be a father. I was always more focused on my career, on building the company. And the night he died, we had this terrible fight. I said things. She stopped, unable to continue. You said things you didn't mean. Marcus finished gently. And now, you're carrying guilt that doesn't belong to you. Victoria looked up sharply. How did you... Because I know what survivor's guilt looks like, Marcus said. I've carried it myself. My best friend from the Army, Tyler Hayes, white kid from Connecticut, saved my life in Kandahar. Took shrapnel meant for me. He survived, but lost his leg. I spent 2 years thinking I should have been faster, should have seen the IED, should have protected him better. He met Victoria's eyes directly. You know what Tyler told me? He said, Marcus, you're taking guilt that belongs to the Taliban and wearing it like it's yours. Stop it. Honor me by living fully, not by drowning in what-ifs. Victoria felt something crack open inside her chest. 8 months of carefully controlled grief, suddenly demanding release. But I said such terrible things to him. The last words he heard from me were not the last words of your relationship. Marcus interrupted firmly. How long were you married? 8 years. And in those 8 years, how many times did you tell him you loved him? How many ordinary moments did you share? How many times did he know, without question, that you were his partner and he was yours? Victoria's tears fell freely now. Thousands of times. Then those are your last words, Marcus said. One moment of anger doesn't erase 8 years of love. Your husband knew who you were. He knew your heart. And he knew that people say things they don't mean when they're scared. He leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but firm. Mrs. Hayes, you're not guilty of killing your husband. You're guilty of being human. And humans deserve forgiveness, especially from themselves. The words landed like medicine on an open wound, painful but necessary. Victoria sobbed quietly, trying not to wake Emma, while Marcus sat in respectful silence, giving her space to grieve. When she finally regained her composure, Victoria wiped her eyes and managed a shaky smile. Thank you. For Emma, obviously, but also for seeing me, for not letting me hide behind my guilt. My grandmother used to say that pain shared is pain divided, Marcus said. And joy shared is joy multiplied. We're not meant to carry our burdens alone. Victoria looked at this remarkable young man who'd walked through a gauntlet of prejudice to help a stranger's child, and felt ashamed of how close she'd come to refusing his help, how close Emma had come to continued suffering, because Victoria's first instinct had been fear rather than faith in human goodness. Where are you flying to? She asked. Boston, obviously. But what brings you there? Marcus's expression shifted excitement mixed with anxiety. I have an interview tomorrow at Johns Hopkins School of Nursing for their advanced nursing program. He hesitated. It's kind of my dream school. Best nursing program in the country. A full scholarship if I get in. "You'll get in," Victoria said with certainty. "After what I just witnessed. If they don't accept you, they're fools." Marcus smiled but shook his head. "It's competitive. Lots of applicants with better credentials from better schools. I'm coming from Baltimore Community College. Most of the other candidates are from places like Duke or Penn." "But they haven't done what you've done," Victoria pointed out. "They haven't served in combat zones. They haven't learned medicine from Afghan mothers in field hospitals. They haven't," she gestured around the cabin, "walked through what you just walked through to help someone." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent into San Francisco. They had 40 minutes until landing. Victoria made a decision. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before answering. I'm in San Francisco for 5 days for crucial business meetings. My nanny canceled last minute, which is why I'm traveling alone with Emma. I need someone to help care for her while I'm in meetings. Someone I trust. Someone who clearly knows what they're doing." She saw Marcus start to protest and held up her hand. "I would pay you $500 per day. That's what a professional nanny would cost in San Francisco. And frankly, you've already proven you're worth more. I'll provide a hotel room adjoining mine, all meals and transportation, and I'll make sure you have complete freedom to prepare for your Johns Hopkins interview. That comes first." Marcus stared at her. "Mrs. Hayes, that's very generous, but I can't. $500 a day is more than my mother makes in a week. I couldn't accept—" "You wouldn't be accepting charity," Victoria said firmly. "You'd be providing a crucial service that I desperately need. I have an FDA approval meeting tomorrow that could determine whether our company's breakthrough cancer drug reaches the market. 500 jobs depend on this approval. Thousands of patients need this medication. I cannot do my job effectively if I'm worried about Emma's care." She adjusted Emma in her arms. "But more than that, after what just happened, I trust you. I trust you with my daughter's safety and comfort in a way I haven't trusted anyone since Michael died. That's worth far more than $500 a day." Marcus's mind raced. $500 a day for 5 days, that was $2,500. That would cover 3 months of his rent, his nephew's medical bills that his sister couldn't pay, the Baltimore Community College Fund that had helped other kids like him afford books and supplies. But it also felt like charity dressed up as employment, like wealthy white guilt trying to buy absolution. Victoria saw his hesitation and understood its source. "Marcus, let me be clear about something. I'm not offering this because I feel guilty about my initial reaction to you, though I do feel guilty. I'm offering this because you've demonstrated skills I need and character I admire. If our situations were reversed, if you were the CEO and I was the nursing student, I'd hope you'd give me the same opportunity." She paused, then added quietly, "My husband used to say that the measure of a person isn't what they do when everyone's watching. It's what they do when no one would know the difference. You could have stayed in your seat. No one would have blamed you. But you stood up anyway. That kind of character is rare. And it's exactly what Emma needs right now." Before Marcus could respond, the elderly woman across the aisle, Margaret Chen, stood up abruptly. Her face was pale, and she swayed slightly before steadying herself against the seat back. "Young man," she said, her voice trembling, "I need to apologize to you." Margaret Chen walked across the aisle with deliberate steps, each one seeming to cost her something. At 72, She carried herself with the posture of someone who'd spent a lifetime believing she held the moral high ground. But now that certainty had crumbled, and she looked diminished somehow, as if the weight of realization had physically shrunk her. She stopped in front of Marcus, who remained seated, looking up at her with wary respect. The elderly woman extended her hand, not for a handshake, but palm up, as if offering something. "Young man," Margaret said, her voice shaking, "what I said earlier was wrong. It was rooted in prejudice that I thought that I wanted to believe I'd overcome, but clearly I haven't." Marcus stayed silent, waiting. He'd learned long ago that when white people began these kinds of apologies, the best response was to let them finish before deciding whether the words were genuine or performative. "I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama," Margaret continued. "I was 16 years old in 1963 when the church bombing killed those 4 little girls. I watched the civil rights movement from my comfortable white neighborhood, and I told myself I was one of the good ones because I wasn't actively participating in the violence, because I felt bad about what was happening." Her hand dropped to her side. "But I never did anything. I never marched. I never spoke up when my neighbors used the N-word at dinner parties. I never challenged my own parents when they warned me to stay away from those people. I just watched, and told myself that not being actively racist was enough." The cabin had gone quiet. Even the ambient noise of the engine seemed muted as passengers listened to this elderly white woman confess her sins to a young black man who'd done nothing but help a suffering child. "And today," Margaret's voice cracked, "when I saw you walking toward that baby, my first thought, the very first thought before I could stop it, was that someone should call security. Not because you'd done anything threatening, not because you'd said anything inappropriate, but because you were a black man approaching a white woman and her child." She pressed a hand to her chest as if physically holding her heart together. "And that automatic assumption, that reflexive suspicion, it made me physically ill, because I realized I've spent 60 years congratulating myself for not being racist while carrying the exact same poison that my parents carried. I've just hidden it better, made it more polite." Marcus finally spoke, his voice gentle. "Mrs. Chen, thank you for saying that. It takes courage to acknowledge our prejudices." "No," Margaret said sharply. "Don't let me off that easy. I don't deserve your grace. I'm 72 years old. If I haven't learned by now to see people as people, rather than as threats based on their skin color, what does that say about me? What does that say about how I've spent my life?" She looked around the first-class cabin, at the other passengers who were pretending not to listen. "We're all complicit, all of us who stayed silent, all of us who made assumptions, all of us who thought good intentions were enough." Victoria watched this exchange with something like awe. Margaret Chen was performing the kind of radical honesty that most people avoided their entire lives, the willingness to shatter your own self-image and examine the ugly pieces. But before Marcus could respond, James Patterson stood up 4 rows back. The tech CEO's face was flushed. Whether from anger or embarrassment wasn't immediately clear. "Oh, come on," James said loudly. "This is exactly what's wrong with America. This whole performance of white guilt and praise for doing basic human decency." He gestured at Marcus dismissively. "You helped a crying baby. That's wonderful. But that's called being a decent human being, not being a hero. We don't need to throw a parade every time someone does the bare minimum." His voice carried the practiced authority of someone used to being heard. "And frankly, I'm tired of this narrative that every interaction across racial lines is some profound statement about society. Sometimes a medic helps a baby because that's what medics do. Making it about race diminishes both his professionalism and our ability to move forward as a society." Jessica, the flight attendant, turned toward James with an expression of barely controlled fury. "Mr. Patterson, I know exactly who you are. Your face was all over the news last year when your company settled that discrimination lawsuit." James's face reddened further. "That lawsuit was frivolous." "It was settled for $4 million, Jessica interrupted, her voice cutting, "for systematically passing over qualified black candidates in hiring and promotion. The settlement included mandatory diversity training and reformed hiring practices. So, forgive me if I don't take your lecture about moving forward as a society seriously." She stepped closer, her professionalism cracking to reveal genuine anger. "You want to know what this moment is really about, Mr. Patterson? It's about a man who walked through a gauntlet of suspicion to help a suffering child. A man who absolutely knew that offering help could be misinterpreted as threat. Who knew that in this country, in 2024, a black man approaching a white woman can still end with police arrest, or worse." Jessica's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "And he did it anyway. Not for recognition, not for praise, but because a baby was in pain and he had the skills to help. That's not the bare minimum, Mr. Patterson. That's moral courage that most people, including you and me, don't possess." The cabin was silent, except for the drone of engines. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably, caught between competing narratives about what they'd witnessed. James opened his mouth to respond, but Victoria stood up, carefully adjusting Emma in her arms. When the CEO of a $6 billion company stands, people tend to listen. "Mr. Patterson," Victoria said, her voice carrying the authority of boardrooms and hostile negotiations, "you're partially right. Basic human decency shouldn't require recognition. But let me ask you something. When's the last time you offered help to someone when that offer could be seen as threatening? When's the last time you put yourself at risk to help a stranger?" She didn't wait for an answer. Marcus walked forward, knowing that people might see him as a threat, knowing that passengers might call security, knowing that in the worst case, this flight could land with him in handcuffs because someone decided a black man near a white baby was inherently suspicious. Victoria's voice gained intensity. "He risked his freedom, his safety, his dignity, all to help my daughter. That's not basic decency, Mr. Patterson. That's extraordinary courage. And the fact that you can't see the difference says more about your privilege than his actions." James looked like he'd been slapped. Around him, other passengers murmured agreement or discomfort depending on their perspectives, but then Marcus did something that stunned everyone. He stood and extended his hand to James Patterson. "Sir," Marcus said quietly, "I understand your perspective. Recognition can feel performative, and you're right that I didn't help Emma for praise. I helped because she needed it, and I had the skills to do it." He kept his hand extended until James, confused and somewhat humiliated, finally shook it. "But here's the thing," Marcus continued, his voice gentle but firm. "You're right that racial barriers shouldn't exist. They shouldn't. In a perfect world, I could have walked forward to help a baby and no one would have thought twice about it. But we don't live in that world yet. And pretending we do, pretending that race doesn't affect how people perceive my actions, that doesn't move us forward. That just lets people who benefit from the status quo feel comfortable. He released James's hand. I don't need recognition, but I do need the assumption of good intentions that gets automatically extended to people who look like you. I need to be able to offer help without calculating the risk of being perceived as a threat. That's not special treatment. That's just equal treatment. Marcus's eyes held James's steadily. And if that feels like too much to ask, then maybe the problem isn't my expectations. Maybe it's your comfort with inequality. The words landed like a physical blow. James sank back into his seat, his phone clutched in his hand. The recording he'd been making ready to post on social media about an aggressive black man in first class suddenly felt obscene. Victoria watched this exchange with growing respect. Marcus Washington had just delivered one of the most devastating and gracious responses to prejudice she'd ever witnessed. He'd dismantled James's argument while simultaneously offering him dignity and a path forward. That combination of moral clarity and compassion was rare in her experience. Margaret Chen was crying openly now. "My daughter," she said suddenly, as if the confession had been torn from her. "My daughter Rachel married a black man in 1985 in Birmingham. She couldn't continue for a moment. "I told her she was making a mistake. I said I was concerned about the difficulties they'd face. But that was a lie. The truth was I was ashamed of what my neighbors would think, what my bridge club would say." She wiped her eyes with shaking hands. "Rachel gave me a choice: accept her marriage or lose her. I chose my comfort over my daughter. I chose my reputation over my child. And I haven't seen Rachel or met my grandchildren in 30 years. The confession hung in the air like smoke. Victoria felt her chest tighten with vicarious pain for both Margaret and her estranged daughter. "That heart attack you mentioned earlier," Margaret said to Marcus. "The one where you saved my life. The cardiologist told me it was stress-induced. Decades of carrying shame and regret that I refused to acknowledge. My body literally couldn't handle the cognitive dissonance anymore." She looked around the first-class cabin. "I'm 72 years old. I could die tomorrow. And I've wasted 3 decades estranged from my daughter because I was too proud, too comfortable, too convinced of my own righteousness to admit I was wrong." Margaret turned back to Marcus. "You showed me today that it's never too late to face the truth, never too late to choose courage over comfort. And if I survive long enough to make amends with Rachel, it will be because you gave me an example of what real courage looks like." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Flight attendants, prepare cabin for landing. We'll be on the ground in San Francisco in approximately 20 minutes. But no one moved. The cabin remained suspended in the weight of what had been said, the truths that had been acknowledged, the bridges that might possibly begin to be built. Marcus looked at Margaret Chen with something like compassion. This elderly white woman had just performed the hardest kind of honesty, the kind that destroyed your self-image and forced you to rebuild from the ruins. "Mrs. Chen," he said gently, "my grandmother used to tell me that we're never too old to grow, never too broken to heal. If you want to reconnect with your daughter, start today. Not tomorrow, Not after you figure out the perfect words. Today. He pulled out his phone. Can I give you something? It's a line from that spiritual I was humming Wade in the Water. My grandmother explained the full meaning to me when I was young. Margaret nodded, unable to speak. The song was about taking risks to reach freedom, Marcus said. About stepping into uncertain water because safety and freedom don't always coexist. Sometimes you have to wade into uncomfortable, scary territory to get to the other side where healing waits. He met her eyes directly. That's what I did today when I walked forward to help Emma. That's what you're doing right now by admitting your mistakes. We're both wading in water. And maybe that's what growth always looks like. Uncomfortable, risky, but necessary. The plane began its descent into San Francisco, the change in altitude making everyone's ears pop. Emma stirred slightly in Victoria's arms but didn't wake, still peaceful from Marcus's intervention. Victoria looked at her sleeping daughter and felt something shift in her chest. 8 months of carefully controlled grief beginning to crack open. Marcus had helped Emma. Yes. But he'd also helped Victoria see something she'd been avoiding, that running from pain by drowning herself in work wasn't healing. It was just slower dying. Michael's voice echoed in her memory, from a fight they'd had years ago about her working through Christmas. Victoria, you can't control everything. Sometimes you just have to trust that the people who love you will catch you if you fall. She'd been so afraid of falling for 8 months, so terrified that if she stopped moving, stopped working, stopped controlling every variable, she'd shatter completely. But watching Marcus, who carried his own trauma and kept showing up anyway, who offered help despite the risk, who maintained grace under suspicion, Victoria realized that strength wasn't about never falling, it was about standing up despite being afraid. Marcus, she said quietly, I want to tell you something. Before you decide about my job offer. He waited, attentive. My husband died because I chose work over our relationship on the night of his accident, Victoria said, the words coming easier this time. We had a terrible fight. I said cruel things. And 15 minutes after he walked out, a drunk driver killed him. I've spent 8 months believing that if I'd just chosen differently, if I'd put family first, he'd still be alive. She looked down at Emma. And I've been terrified that I'm failing as a mother, that I don't have the natural instinct, that I'm too broken by grief to give Emma what she needs. Marcus listened without interrupting, recognizing the sound of someone who needed to speak more than be answered. But watching you today, Victoria continued, seeing how you offered help despite the risk, despite knowing people might reject you or suspect you or worse, it made me realize something. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite being afraid. And maybe that's what Emma needs. Not a perfect mother who never doubts herself, just a mother who keeps showing up despite being terrified she's failing. She met Marcus's eyes. So when I offer you this job, I'm not just hiring childcare. I'm asking you to teach me, to show me how you develop that kind of courage, how you keep showing up for people even when the world teaches you to protect yourself first. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Mrs. Hayes, my grandmother raised me after my father died. She cleaned houses for wealthy families, worked double shifts, sacrificed everything to give me opportunities she never had. And you know what she told me? He smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. She said, "Baby, the world's going to try to make you small, going to try to convince you that your black skin is a threat instead of a crown. But you got healer's blood in your veins. When you see somebody hurting, you help them. Even if helping makes you visible, even if visible gets you hurt." Marcus looked at Emma sleeping peacefully. "I learned courage from my grandmother, from watching her work 3 jobs and still show up to my school plays, from watching her forgive people who treated her like she was invisible, from watching her choose compassion even when the world gave her every reason to choose bitterness." He turned to Victoria. "You want to learn courage. You're already showing it. You're here. You're working despite your grief, You're raising a daughter alone while running a company that employs 500 people. Before he could finish, the plane touched down with a gentle bump. The cabin erupted in applause not for the landing, but for something else, something harder to name, perhaps relief that they'd witnessed grace under pressure, perhaps gratitude for unexpected lessons about courage and prejudice and the hard work of growth. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Victoria made her decision. "Marcus, I'm not going to pressure you, but my offer stands. $500 a day, hotel accommodations, complete freedom to prepare for your Hopkins interview. Think about it and let me know before we deplane." She paused, then added, "But regardless of whether you accept, I want to help however I can. My company has a foundation that supports healthcare education in underserved communities. If you're interested, I'd like to discuss scholarship opportunities that go beyond what Hopkins might offer." Marcus felt overwhelmed. 12 hours ago, he'd boarded this plane as an invisible nursing student from Baltimore, hoping his Hopkins interview might change his life. Now a billionaire CEO was offering him employment and educational support. And he'd somehow become the center of conversations about race and courage that usually made him want to disappear. But as the seatbelt sign dinged off and passengers began gathering their belongings, Marcus realized something profound, sometimes being visible, really visible. Fully human was worth the risk. Because visibility meant connection, and connection was how people healed. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "I accept your offer. For Emma's sake, and for mine." Victoria smiled the first genuine smile Marcus had seen from her. "Call me Victoria. I think we're past formalities." As they prepared to deplane, Margaret Chen touched Marcus's arm gently. "Young man, when you see your grandmother next, please thank her for me. Thank her for raising a son who had the courage to show an old woman that growth is still possible." Marcus nodded, his throat tight with emotion. The plane doors opened. San Francisco waited. And with it, the next chapter of a story that had begun with a crying baby and a decision to wade into uncertain water despite every reason to stay safe and invisible. San Francisco General Hospital's emergency department hummed with controlled chaos at 9 p.m. Marcus sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, his hands freshly bandaged from the CPR compressions that had saved Margaret Chen's life. Across from him, Victoria paced while hospital staff examined Emma, checking for any complications from the prescription medication that shouldn't have been in her system. The discovery had come 30 minutes after landing. As paramedics boarded to transport Margaret to the hospital, an EMT had noticed Victoria's diaper bag had spilled during the commotion. Among the scattered contents, wipes, bottles, Extra clothes was a prescription bottle that didn't belong. "Ma'am," the EMT had said, holding up the amber container, "when did you start giving your daughter diphenhydramine?" Victoria had stared at the bottle blankly. "What, I've never seen that before." Her pediatrician only prescribed vitamin D drops. The EMT's expression had shifted from routine to concerned. "This is adult-strength Benadryl. If someone's been dosing a 7-month-old with antihistamines to make her sleep, it would explain the excessive crying she's experiencing, withdrawal symptoms between doses." The words had hit Victoria like a physical blow. She'd immediately thought of Jennifer, the nanny who'd started 2 weeks ago. Jennifer, who'd bragged about her special techniques for getting babies to sleep through the night. Jennifer, who'd been alone with Emma for 8 to 10 hours a day while Victoria worked late at the office, drowning her grief in pharmaceutical deals and board meetings. Someone had been drugging her baby. And Victoria, consumed by work and guilt and desperate attempts to avoid feeling her husband's death, hadn't noticed. Now, waiting for the doctor's assessment. Victoria felt a different kind of guilt, sharper and more immediate than the diffuse shame she'd carried about Michael's death. This guilt had teeth. This guilt screamed that she'd failed at the most basic requirement of motherhood, keeping her child safe. Marcus watched Victoria's spiral with the trained eye of someone who'd seen trauma responses in combat zones. She was heading toward a full breakdown, the kind that came when all your carefully constructed defenses finally crumbled. "Victoria," he said quietly. She didn't respond, just kept pacing. "Victoria, look at me." She stopped, her eyes wild with barely controlled panic. I didn't know someone was hurting my baby. What kind of mother doesn't notice when someone is drugging their child? The kind who's been running from grief for 8 months, Marcus said gently but firmly. The kind who's been trying to die without dying by working herself to exhaustion. The kind who's human and fallible and doing her best under impossible circumstances. Victoria shook her head violently. "That's not good enough. My best isn't good enough." Emma deserved better. She deserved a mother who was present instead of hiding in conference rooms. She deserved... Her voice broke. She deserved Michael. He would have noticed. He would have protected her. Marcus stood and moved to Victoria, close enough to ground her, but not so close as to crowd her. "Michael isn't here. And you can torture yourself with what-ifs until you destroy yourself. Or you can focus on what matters. Emma is safe now. You know about the problem now. You can protect her now." "But I should have known before." "Should have doesn't help anyone," Marcus interrupted. "Should have is just another way of punishing yourself for being human. What helps is what happens next." A doctor emerged from the examination room, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm Dr. Sarah Martinez. I've completed Emma's examination." Victoria rushed over, her heart hammering. "Is she okay? Did the medication cause permanent damage? Will she—" Dr. Martinez held up a calming hand. "Emma is going to be fine. The diphenhydramine levels in her system are elevated but not dangerous. We're keeping her for overnight observation as a precaution, but I don't anticipate any lasting effects." Victoria felt her knees weaken with relief. Marcus moved to support her elbow, steady and unobtrusive. However, Dr. Martinez continued, her expression becoming more serious, I need to inform you that I'm legally required to report this to Child Protective Services. Any case involving potential child endangerment through medication requires a mandatory report. Victoria felt the world tilt. You think I did this? You think I drugged my own daughter? I'm not making that determination, Dr. Martinez said carefully. CPS will investigate to understand what happened. They'll interview you, interview anyone who's had regular access to Emma, and make recommendations. Given that you immediately brought Emma in for treatment and that you're clearly distressed by this discovery, I don't anticipate them removing Emma from your care. But the investigation is mandatory. She softened slightly. Mrs. Hayes, I can see you're a loving mother who's had a terrible shock. The investigation will help establish what happened and ensure Emma's safety going forward. Try to view it as a protective measure, not a punishment. Victoria nodded numbly, unable to speak. After Dr. Martinez left to complete her paperwork, Victoria sank into a chair and put her face in her hands. CPS investigation. My company's general counsel is going to have a field day with this. The board will question my judgment. The FDA might delay our approval if they think the CEO is under investigation for child endangerment. Or, Marcus said, settling into the chair beside her, you could stop thinking like a CEO for 5 minutes and let yourself feel scared and angry that someone hurt your baby. Victoria looked up sharply. Excuse me. You heard me, Marcus said, his tone gentle but unyielding. You just found out someone was drugging your daughter, and your first thought is about board meetings and FDA approvals. That's not strength, Victoria. That's avoidance. The words cut through Victoria's defensive layers like a scalpel. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. I don't know how to just feel things. Michael was the one who felt things. I was the one who solved problems. Feeling things is how you solve this particular problem, Marcus said. Emma doesn't need a CEO right now. She needs a mother who's present enough to feel scared and angry and protective. Those feelings aren't weaknesses. They're what keep children safe. Before Victoria could respond, Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his expression shifted surprise mixed with something deeper, more complex. Everything okay? Victoria asked, grateful for the momentary distraction from her own crisis. Marcus stared at his phone, his hands beginning to tremble slightly. It's a text from Tyler Hayes, my army buddy, the one I told you about. The one who saved my life in Kandahar. What did he say? Marcus's voice was barely audible. He sent me a photo from his cousin's wedding and asked if I'd seen his sister-in-law on my flight to San Francisco. Said she was traveling with her baby daughter Emma. The words hung in the air for 3 heartbeats before their full meaning registered. Victoria's face went pale. Tyler Hayes. Your army buddy is named Tyler Hayes. Marcus nodded slowly, still staring at the photo on his screen. Michael Hayes was my husband, Victoria whispered. Tyler Hayes is Michael's younger brother. Doom. They stared at each other as the impossible coincidence, or perhaps it wasn't coincidence at all, settled over them like snow. Marcus, the man Tyler saved in Afghanistan, had just saved Tyler's niece. The debt had come full circle in a way that defied probability and suggested something larger at work. Tyler talked about you, Victoria said, her voice shaking. After his injury, when he was recovering at Walter Reed, he told Michael about the medic who stayed with him for 9 hours during evacuation, who talked him through the pain and promised he'd walk again even though everyone else thought he'd never leave that hospital bed. Tyler said that medic sang spirituals and made him feel less alone in the worst moment of his life. Marcus's eyes filled with tears. Tyler saved my life. Took shrapnel meant for me. I've carried guilt about that for 2 years, thinking I should have been faster, should have protected him better. Michael wanted to meet you, Victoria continued, the words tumbling out now. Tyler got your contact information about 6 weeks before Michael died. They were planning to invite you to dinner, to thank you for saving Tyler's life. But by the time Tyler finally tracked you down, Michael was already gone. The hospital's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere down the hall, a baby cried, not Emma, but the sound made both of them flinch. This can't be coincidence, Marcus said finally. The probability of me being on that specific flight, in that specific seat, close enough to hear Emma crying, and having the exact skills needed to help her, Victoria added. And both of us being connected through Michael and Tyler, the odds are astronomical, Marcus finished. They sat in silence, processing the weight of this revelation. In many faith traditions, this kind of convergence would be called divine intervention. In psychology, it might be labeled synchronicity, meaningful coincidence that suggested deeper patterns in human experience. But labels didn't capture the feeling of standing at the intersection of multiple lives and recognizing that some debts transcend logic. Tyler never stopped feeling guilty about me losing my leg, Victoria said quietly. He wrote about it in his letters from rehab. Said he felt like Michael blamed himself for not being there, for not protecting his little brother. Tyler told me the opposite, Marcus said. He said Michael was his hero. Said Michael never made him feel broken or less than after his injury. Just loved him through the recovery and celebrated every milestone. Victoria felt tears streaming down her face, 8 months of held grief finally breaking through. Michael would have loved this. Would have loved that you helped Emma. He always believed that good people found each other eventually, that the universe had a way of connecting people who needed to be connected. My grandmother says the same thing, Marcus said softly. She calls it divine appointment. The idea that sometimes we're put in specific places at specific times to help specific people, and that those moments are never really random, even when they seem impossible. A nurse approached with paperwork for Victoria to sign consent forms for Emma's overnight observation, information about the CPS investigation process, prescriptions for proper ear infection treatment. As Victoria mechanically signed documents, Marcus texted Tyler back. The response came within seconds. Then Tyler's name appeared on Marcus's phone screen with an incoming call. Marcus answered, putting the call on speaker so Victoria could hear. Marcus, brother, please tell me Victoria and Emma are okay. Tyler's voice was tight with worry. My mom just called. She has some kind of alert on Victoria's credit cards after Michael died, to make sure she was okay financially. She saw a charge at San Francisco General and freaked out. They're both okay, Marcus assured him. Emma had an ear infection that I was able to help with on the flight, and Victoria's here at the hospital for Emma's overnight observation. You were on Victoria's flight. Tyler's confusion was evident. And you helped wait. Back up. How did you end up on the same flight? Marcus explained briefly his Hopkins interview, the crying baby, the decision to walk forward despite the risks, the impossible connection they'd discovered. Tyler was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "Marcus, man, I don't even know what to say. You saved my life in Kandahar, and now you've saved my niece. How does anyone repay that kind of debt?" "You don't," Marcus said simply. "That's not how this works. You helped me because that's who you are. I helped Emma because that's who I try to be. The debt doesn't need repaying. It just needs to keep moving forward." Victoria took the phone from Marcus, her hands shaking. "Tyler, it's Victoria. I know we haven't talked much since the funeral. I've been hiding, I think, from everyone, from grief, from the fact that Michael's gone and I don't know how to exist without him." "Victoria, you don't have to explain," Tyler said gently. "Grief doesn't follow a timeline, but I'm glad you're okay. I'm glad Emma's okay. And his voice broke. "I'm so grateful Marcus was there. Michael would have loved this. Would have loved knowing that the guy I've been boring everyone with stories about for 2 years ended up being exactly where you and Emma needed him." Margaret Chen appeared at the end of the hallway, walking slowly with a hospital attendant supporting her elbow. She'd been cleared for discharge. Her heart attack had been stress-induced rather than the result of arterial blockage, and with proper rest and stress management, her prognosis was good. She spotted Victoria and Marcus and made her way over, declining the attendant's continued assistance with polite firmness. "Mrs. Hayes," Margaret said quietly, "I wanted to check on Emma before I left. Is she going to be all right?" Victoria nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The elderly woman who'd initially objected to Marcus helping Emma now stood before them with such genuine concern that Victoria felt ashamed of her initial dismissive thoughts about Margaret being just another prejudiced old woman. "She's going to be fine," Victoria finally managed. "They're keeping her overnight for observation, but Dr. Martinez said she expects a full recovery." Margaret's relief was visible. She turned to Marcus. "Young man, I've spent the past 2 hours in cardiac monitoring thinking about what you said, about wading into water, about choosing courage over comfort." She pulled out her phone with shaking hands. "I called my daughter Rachel, first time in 30 years, left a voicemail, told her," Margaret's voice cracked, "told her I was wrong, that I chose my pride over my child, and that I'm sorry, that I want to meet my grandchildren if she'll let me, that I'm 72 years old and I don't want to die estranged from the people I should have loved better." Tears streamed down her weathered face. "I don't know if she'll call back. I don't know if 30 years of damage can be healed with one voicemail, but you taught me that trying is better than dying with regrets." Marcus stood and took Margaret's hand gently. "Mrs. Chen, making that call took more courage than most people show in a lifetime. Whatever happens next, you did the right thing." "I'm flying back to Birmingham tomorrow," Margaret said. "But I wanted you both to know, wanted Emma to know, when she's old enough to understand that today changed my life, that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers." She looked at Victoria. "Your daughter is lucky to have you as a mother. Don't let anyone, including yourself, convince you otherwise." After Margaret left, Victoria and Marcus sat in silence, processing the weight of the day. It was nearly midnight. In 6 hours, Victoria had her crucial FDA meeting. In 8 hours, Marcus had his Hopkins interview. But both of those things felt less important somehow in the face of what had transpired. "Marcus," Victoria said quietly, "I need to tell you something. When you first walked toward me on that plane, my immediate reaction was fear, and I need you to understand how much I hate that about myself. How ashamed I am that my first instinct was suspicion based on nothing but your skin color."
"I know," Marcus said simply. "I saw it in your eyes. I've seen it 1,000 times before."
"But you helped Emma anyway, because Emma's suffering wasn't conditional on her mother's prejudices," Marcus said. "Babies don't carry their parents' biases. They just need help when they're hurting." Victoria nodded slowly. "Michael used to tell me that the measure of character isn't what you do when it's easy. It's what you do when it costs you something. You risked humiliation and worse to help a stranger's child. That's—" she struggled for words. "That's the kind of person I want to be. The kind of person I want to teach Emma to be." A doctor appeared to let them know Emma was settled in her observation room, and they could see her. Victoria and Marcus walked down the sterile hospital corridor side by side, a wealthy white CEO and a black veteran nursing student, connected now by threads too complex to untangle and too strong to ignore. Emma was asleep in a hospital crib, monitors tracking her vitals, an IV delivering fluids and antibiotics. She looked impossibly small and vulnerable, and Victoria felt her heart crack open at the sight of her daughter in a hospital bed. "I almost lost her," Victoria whispered. "Not from the medication, from my own inability to be present, from drowning in work instead of dealing with grief, from failing to notice when someone was hurting her because I was too busy trying not to feel my own pain." Marcus stood beside her, looking down at Emma's peaceful face. "But you didn't lose her. She's here. She's safe. And now you know what you need to change." Victoria turned to look at him. "Marcus, I meant what I said on the plane. I want to hire you to help with Emma while I'm in San Francisco. But more than that, I need someone in my life who has the courage to tell me truth, who won't let me hide behind work and control in the illusion that I have everything figured out." And she paused, choosing her words carefully. "My company has a foundation that provides scholarships and support for healthcare workers from underserved communities. After your Hopkins interview tomorrow, I want to discuss how we might support your education not as charity, but as an investment in the kind of healthcare professional our country desperately needs." Marcus felt overwhelmed. 24 hours ago, he'd been an invisible nursing student from Baltimore, hoping his Hopkins interview might open doors. Now he stood in a San Francisco hospital with a CEO offering him employment, educational support, and something that felt almost like family. "Victoria," he said quietly, "I don't know how to accept help. I've spent my whole life being taught that accepting help from white people, especially wealthy white people, means owing something I can't repay, means becoming dependent, means losing my autonomy." He looked at Emma, sleeping peacefully. "But my grandmother also taught me that pride that prevents you from accepting legitimate help isn't strength. It's just another kind of self-destruction. So I'm going to choose to trust that your offer is genuine, and I'm going to try to believe I deserve the opportunities you're offering." Victoria extended her hand. Marcus shook it, And in that gesture something shifted from strangers connected by crisis to something approaching chosen family. Emma stirred in her sleep and made a soft sound, not distress, just the normal vocalizations of a dreaming baby. Both Victoria and Marcus moved toward her instinctively, and in that synchronized protective movement, they recognized what was forming between them, a bond forged in crisis but strong enough to transcend it. The night stretched ahead. Tomorrow would bring FDA meetings and Hopkins interviews and CPS investigations and media attention about the dramatic flight where a veteran saved lives. But for now, in the quiet of a hospital room with a sleeping baby between them, Victoria and Marcus simply sat, two wounded people beginning the slow work of healing, connected by a debt that had come full circle, and a child who needed them both. 6 months had passed since that November flight, and spring had transformed San Francisco into a riot of cherry blossoms and morning fog that burned off by noon. Marcus Washington stood at the podium of Johns Hopkins School of Nursing's graduation ceremony, his hands no longer shaking the way they had on that airplane, though the memories of what transpired there remained vivid. He'd gotten into Hopkins, full scholarship, just as Victoria had predicted. The interview had gone well, better than well. Actually, because the admissions committee had been impressed not just by his academic credentials, but by the real-world medical experience he'd accumulated in combat zones and Baltimore's understaffed hospitals. But what had truly sealed his acceptance was a phone call the committee received from Dr. Sarah Martinez at San Francisco General, who'd witnessed Marcus's calm professionalism during Emma's medical crisis and Margaret Chen's cardiac arrest. "When I served in Afghanistan," Marcus told the assembled graduates and their families, his voice carrying across the auditorium with the confidence he'd built over 6 months of intensive study and clinical rotations. "I learned that medicine isn't just about procedures and protocols. It's about seeing the humanity in suffering regardless of who's suffering, regardless of what prejudices or fears we carry, regardless of what it costs us personally to offer help." In the audience, Victoria sat with Emma on her lap. The now 13-month-old was healthy and thriving, her ear infections long since resolved, her medication screening clean, her development tracking perfectly normal, despite the trauma she'd experienced. Emma wore a tiny purple dress that Michael's mother had sent Victoria had finally reconnected with her in-laws after months of grief-induced isolation and kept reaching toward the stage where Marcus stood, as if recognizing the voice that had first brought her comfort. Beside Victoria sat Margaret Chen, fully recovered from her stress-induced heart attack. But the real miracle wasn't her physical recovery, it was the young black woman sitting on her other side. Keisha Chen, Margaret's 35-year-old granddaughter, had accepted her grandmother's phone call 3 days after that November flight. The conversation had lasted 4 hours and involved more tears than either woman thought possible. It hadn't healed 30 years of estrangement overnight, but it had opened a door that both women were now walking through with careful, painful, hopeful steps. "On a plane last November," Marcus continued, "I faced a choice. I could stay in my seat, protect myself from the risk of being misunderstood or suspected, and avoid the possibility of rejection or worse. Or I could stand up to help a suffering child, knowing that offering help across racial lines in America still carries risks that white Americans rarely have to calculate." He paused, letting the weight of that truth settle over the audience. Some people shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded in recognition. "I chose to stand up, Not because I'm particularly brave or special, but because a baby was in pain, and I had the skills to help. That decision led me here to this moment, this degree, this opportunity to serve communities that desperately need health care professionals who understand what it means to be underserved and overlooked. Marcus's eyes found Victoria's in the crowd. She smiled, and he saw in her expression how much they'd both changed. The brittle, grief-stricken CEO he'd met 6 months ago had softened without losing her strength. She'd started therapy to process Michael's death, had reconnected with her daughter in ways that went beyond simply providing care, and had begun using Hayes Pharmaceuticals' resources to address healthcare inequities in meaningful ways rather than just writing checks to ease her conscience.
But I didn't get here alone, Marcus continued.
I got here because someone chose to see past her own prejudices, to trust a stranger, to recognize that healing comes from unexpected places and unexpected people. Mrs. Victoria Hayes, would you stand, please? Victoria looked startled, but rose, awkwardly balancing Emma on her hip. The audience applauded politely, unsure yet where this was going. Mrs. Hayes didn't just give me a job helping care for her daughter during a difficult week, Marcus said. She invested in my education. She created opportunities through her company's foundation. But more importantly, she taught me that growth isn't about perfection. It's about the willingness to acknowledge when we're wrong and do better. He turned his attention to the rest of the audience. We live in a divided country, a divided world. But I believe that compassion, real, risky, uncomfortable compassion, can bridge any divide. I believe that choosing to help someone, even when that choice makes you vulnerable, is the most revolutionary act any of us can perform. Marcus gestured to Margaret and Keisha. Mrs. Margaret Chen, would you also stand, and your granddaughter, Keisha? Margaret rose slowly, leaning on Keisha for support. The two women, separated by decades of estrangement, stood together now, their reconciliation still fragile but growing stronger. Mrs. Chen taught me that we're never too old to grow, Marcus said. Never too set in our ways to change. Never too broken to heal. She spent 30 years estranged from her daughter because of prejudices she was too proud to acknowledge. And at 72 years old, after a heart attack that nearly killed her, she made the hardest choice of her life. She chose truth over comfort. She called her daughter. She admitted she was wrong, and she's been rebuilding that relationship ever since. The audience was silent now, recognizing they were witnessing something more profound than a typical graduation speech. These women, Victoria and Margaret, they didn't start as heroes, Marcus said. They started as regular people carrying regular prejudices, making regular mistakes. But they chose growth. They chose discomfort. They chose to wade into water that was scary and uncertain because freedom and healing waited on the other side. He pulled out his phone and displayed a photo on the large screen behind him, the security footage image Victoria had framed, showing Marcus holding Emma on the airplane. The moment after her crying stopped, the baby's tiny hand reaching toward his face. The exhaustion and relief on Victoria's features. The weight of what that moment represented. This is the image that changed my life, Marcus said. But it's not just about a medic helping a baby. It's about all of us choosing, every single day, to see each other's humanity, To reach across the divides that separate us, divides of race, class, assumption, and fear, and simply offer help to someone who needs it. As Marcus concluded his speech and accepted his diploma, the audience rose in standing ovation. But the real transformation was happening in smaller, quieter ways throughout that auditorium. Margaret squeezed Keisha's hand and whispered, "Thank you for giving me another chance." Victoria kissed Emma's forehead and silently promised Michael that she would keep showing up, keep trying, keep learning to be the mother their daughter deserved. And James Patterson, yes, even James Patterson was there. His son Jordan, graduating alongside Marcus, sat in uncomfortable recognition that his own company's recent diversity initiatives weren't performative gestures but necessary corrections to real harm. After the ceremony, Victoria hosted a small celebration at her San Francisco hotel suite. The guest list was unusual. Marcus and his grandmother Rosa, who'd flown in from Baltimore, Victoria and Emma, Margaret and Keisha, Tyler Hayes on video call from his physical therapy session in Connecticut, Jessica Williams, the flight attendant who'd defended Marcus that day, and even Dr. Sarah Martinez, who'd treated Emma and reported the medication incident that led to Jennifer's arrest. The nanny investigation had concluded 3 months ago. Jennifer had been charged with multiple counts of child endangerment. Emma wasn't her only victim. She'd been systematically drugging infants in her care to make them easy and maintain her reputation as a miracle worker with difficult babies. She was awaiting trial. And Victoria had testified at the preliminary hearing with a clarity and strength that came from finally processing her grief rather than running from it. "I want to make a toast," Victoria said, raising her glass of champagne while carefully supporting Emma with her other arm. "6 months ago I was drowning in grief, in guilt, in the desperate attempt to control everything because I was terrified of feeling anything. My daughter was suffering, and I didn't even notice because I was too busy trying to die without dying." Emma babbled happily and reached for the champagne glass. Victoria gently redirected her toward a sippy cup instead. "Marcus, you saved Emma's life that day on the plane, but you also saved mine. You showed me that strength isn't about control, it's about vulnerability. That courage isn't about fearlessness, it's about acting despite being afraid. That healing doesn't come from avoiding pain, it comes from walking through it." She turned to Margaret and Keisha. "And you two showed me that reconciliation is possible. That 30 years of damage can begin to heal with one phone call. That it's never too late to choose love over pride." Margaret wiped tears from her eyes. "Victoria, dear, you're giving us too much credit. We're still figuring this out, still learning how to be grandmother and granddaughter after all these years." "But you're trying," Victoria said. "That's what matters. You're showing up despite it being uncomfortable and uncertain, and sometimes painful. That's courage." Marcus's grandmother Rosa spoke up, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived 8 decades of life in America as a black woman. "My grandson tells me you've done more than just hire him and pay for his education. Mrs. Hayes, he says you've been learning, really learning. Not just reading books and attending diversity training, but examining your own heart and acknowledging the prejudices you didn't want to see." Victoria nodded, not trying to defend herself or minimize Rosa's observation. "I'm trying. I fail often.
Sometimes I catch myself making assumptions I thought I'd unlearned. But at least now I'm paying attention. At least now I'm not pretending that good intentions are enough.
Tyler Hayes' face on the video screen smiled broadly. Marcus, brother, I still can't believe you ended up on that flight with Victoria and Emma. The odds are astronomical, several people said in unison, and the room erupted in laughter. But maybe that's the point, Tyler continued. Maybe sometimes the universe puts people exactly where they need to be, exactly when they need to be there. You saved my life in Kandahar. You saved Emma's life on that plane. You saved Margaret's life with CPR. At some point, we have to stop calling it coincidence and recognize it as purpose. Marcus shook his head, smiling. I'm just a nursing student who happened to be in the right place at the right time. No, Rosa said firmly. You're my grandson who chose compassion over safety, who chose visibility over protection, who chose to help despite knowing it might hurt you. That's not luck or coincidence or even purpose. That's character, and character is always a choice. Emma suddenly lunged from Victoria's arms toward Marcus, making the whole room laugh. Marcus caught her easily, and Emma immediately began patting his face with her chubby hands and babbling what sounded almost like Marcus, though at 13 months, her vocabulary was still mostly joyful nonsense. Her first word was your name, Victoria said, not for the first time. Not Mama, not Dada, Marcus, the person who made her feel safe when she was in pain. Dr. Martinez spoke up. Can I share something that night in the emergency room? I watched you two, Victoria and Marcus, and I saw something I don't see often in my work. I saw two people from completely different worlds finding common ground in their shared commitment to a child's well-being. No ego, no agenda. Just two humans recognizing that their differences mattered less than their shared purpose. She paused, choosing her words carefully. In 20 years of emergency medicine, I've seen a lot of tragedy. But I've also seen moments of grace, moments when people choose to be better than their circumstances or their prejudices or their pain would suggest. That night was one of those moments, and I'm honored to have witnessed it. Jessica Williams raised her own glass. I'd like to add something. As a black woman working in service industries, I calculate risk every single day. I calculated risk when Marcus approached me on that plane, asking to help. I saw a young black man trying to do something good, and I saw all the ways it could go wrong for him. But I also saw a baby suffering and a mother at the end of her rope. She looked at Marcus with profound respect. You took the bigger risk, brother. You walked into first class knowing you might be seen as a threat, knowing that helping could be misinterpreted, and you did it anyway. That's not just medical skill, that's moral courage. The evening wore on, filled with stories and laughter and the occasional tears that came with processing shared trauma. Emma eventually fell asleep in Marcus's arms, and he transferred her gently to Victoria, maintaining the same supportive position he'd shown her 6 months ago. As guests began to leave, Margaret pulled Marcus aside. Young man, I need to tell you something. My daughter, Rachel Keisha's mother, is a social worker in Birmingham. She spent 30 years working with families affected by poverty, addiction, and systemic racism. When I finally told her about what happened on that plane, about how you helped Emma and then saved my life, do you know what she said? Marcus shook his head. She said, Mama, Maybe God gave you a heart attack so you'd finally understand what I've been trying to tell you for 30 years, that black people have been offering help to white people forever, despite being rejected and suspected and harmed for it. Maybe you needed to see that courage up close before you could recognize how much you'd missed. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She was right. I needed to see your courage before I could find my own, before I could make that phone call and risk rejection from my own daughter. You gave me a model for what it looks like to choose vulnerability over protection. She pulled out her phone and showed Marcus a photo, a family dinner from the previous weekend. Margaret, Rachel, Keisha, and 3 other grandchildren Marcus had never met, all sitting around a table laden with food. They were laughing at something off camera, the kind of genuine joy that comes from relationships being rebuilt. This is happening because you chose to help a crying baby, Margaret said simply. The ripple effects of that choice have spread farther than you know. After everyone left, Victoria and Marcus sat in the hotel suite's living room while Emma slept peacefully in the bedroom. The San Francisco skyline glittered through floor-to-ceiling windows, and the silence between them was comfortable, earned through months of building trust. "Marcus," Victoria said quietly, "I need to tell you something. Hayes Pharmaceuticals' FDA approval came through last month. The cancer drug we've been developing is going to market. Thousands of patients will get treatment they desperately need." "That's wonderful," Marcus said. "You must be relieved." "I am. But here's the thing, I almost wasn't there for the approval meeting. If you hadn't helped Emma on that plane, if I'd had to emergency land or turn back, I would have missed the meeting that sealed the deal. 500 jobs and thousands of patients' lives depended on me being in that room, and I wouldn't have made it without you." She turned to face him directly. "I've been thinking a lot about debt and obligation, about what I owe you and whether this relationship between us is genuine friendship or just my attempt to absolve guilt. And I've realized something: I don't need to have it all figured out. I just need to keep showing up honestly." Marcus smiled. "That's all any of us can do. Show up honestly. Make mistakes. Apologize when we hurt people. Try to do better. That's the work." Hayes Pharmaceuticals' Community Health Initiative launches next month. Victoria said, 200 community health workers trained to provide basic medical care in underserved areas. Marcus, I want you to help lead that program after you finish your graduate work. Not as a token hire, not as my attempt to demonstrate corporate social responsibility, but because you have the skills and the lived experience and the moral clarity we need. She pulled out a folder and handed it to Marcus. "This is the proposed structure, the budget, the goals. I want your honest feedback. Tell me where we're getting it wrong. Tell me where our blind spots are. Help me. Help us build something that actually serves communities rather than just making wealthy people feel good about themselves." Marcus opened the folder and spent several minutes reading through the detailed plans. Victoria watched his face, noting when he nodded in approval and when his expression became more critical. "This is good," Marcus finally said. "Really good, but you're missing something crucial." "What?" "Community leadership," Marcus said. "You've got doctors and nurses and corporate executives on your advisory board, but where are the people from the communities you're trying to serve? Where are the single mothers working 3 jobs? Where are the formerly incarcerated people trying to rebuild their lives? Where are the voices of people who've actually navigated the healthcare system from positions of poverty and powerlessness?" He looked up from the folder. If you want to avoid the trap of wealthy people deciding what poor people need, you have to include poor people in the decision-making, not as recipients of charity, but as equal partners in designing solutions. Victoria felt a flash of defensiveness. She'd worked hard on this initiative, had consulted experts, had invested significant resources, but she recognized the feeling as ego protecting itself from necessary criticism. You're absolutely right. We need to restructure the advisory board. Will you help me identify community leaders who should be included? Yes, Marcus said. But Victoria, you need to pay them. Real money, not just honorariums or token stipends. If you're asking people who work multiple jobs to give you their time and expertise, you need to compensate them fairly. Done, Victoria said without hesitation.
What else are we missing?
They spent the next 2 hours going through the initiative in detail, with Marcus providing the kind of honest, critical feedback that Victoria's usual advisors never offered. He challenged assumptions, pointed out blind spots, and offered concrete suggestions for how to build something genuine rather than performative. As midnight approached, Emma woke crying from the bedroom. Both Victoria and Marcus stood simultaneously, then smiled at their synchronized response. "I've got her," Victoria said. "You've done more than enough caregiving for one day." But Marcus followed her into the bedroom anyway, because that's what people who care about each other do. They show up, even when they're tired, even when it's not technically their responsibility. Emma's cries were different from that November day on the airplane, not pain or distress, just the normal fussiness of a toddler waking from a nap in an unfamiliar place. Victoria picked her up and began the gentle bouncing that Marcus had taught her, and Emma settled quickly.
"You're good at this now," Marcus observed. "Really good." Victoria smiled, the compliment meaning more than Marcus probably realized. "I'm trying. Some days are better than others. Some days I still feel like I'm faking my way through motherhood, but at least now I'm present. At least now I'm trying instead of hiding." Emma reached for Marcus, and Victoria transferred her easily. The toddler immediately snuggled into his shoulder and began that soft humming sound she'd picked up from him, not quite wade in the water, but something close. "She remembers," Victoria whispered, watching her daughter find comfort in Marcus's presence. "They say babies don't remember things from before they can talk, but she remembers you." Marcus hummed the spiritual softly, and Emma's eyes began to close. "Maybe it's not memory, exactly. Maybe it's something deeper, the body remembering safety and comfort, even when the mind can't form words for it." They stood in the quiet hotel room, a makeshift family formed not by blood, but by crisis and choice, and the slow work of building trust across divides. Outside, San Francisco slept. Inside, a baby found peace in the arms of someone who'd chosen visibility over safety, who'd waded into uncertain water because someone needed help. And in that moment, Victoria understood what Michael had been trying to tell her the night he died. Not that work didn't matter, it did. Not that ambition was wrong, it wasn't. But that the most important work, the work that actually mattered at the end of the day, was the work of showing up for the people you loved, the work of choosing connection over control, the work of being present even when presence was painful. "Thank you,"
Victoria whispered to Marcus. "For everything." "Thank you," Marcus replied, "for taking the risk of trusting me, for choosing growth over comfort, for teaching Emma that kindness matters more than fear." Emma, now fully asleep, sighed contentedly between them. And in that sigh was all the hope and healing and hard-won wisdom of people who'd learned that the most revolutionary act is simply choosing to see each other's humanity. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. But it had begun, and that beginning, awkward, uncertain, requiring constant recommitment, was enough. 1 year after that November flight, Victoria Hayes stood in her Connecticut home, watching late autumn sunshine stream through windows that no longer felt like museums preserving a dead man's memory. She'd finally redecorated Michael's office, transforming it from a shrine to grief into a playroom where Emma, now 18 months old, could tumble and explore and grow. The changes had been gradual. First, she donated Michael's clothes to a veterans organization that Marcus had recommended. Then she'd moved back into their bedroom, though it took 3 months before she could sleep through the night without waking in tears. She'd started therapy with a grief counselor who specialized in complicated bereavement, and slowly, painfully slowly, she'd begun to separate her guilt from her grief, to recognize that loving Michael didn't require punishing herself forever for their final argument. Today was special. Today was Emma's first birthday party, but it was also something more, a gathering of the people whose lives had intersected on that airplane and continued to weave together in unexpected ways. Marcus arrived first, driving up from Baltimore, where he now lived while completing his graduate nursing program at Hopkins. He'd been accepted into their advanced practice nursing track with full funding, and he split his time between coursework, clinical rotations, and designing community health programs for Hayes Pharmaceuticals initiative. The work was exhausting but meaningful in ways that his Army service had never quite achieved, helping people heal rather than helping them survive combat. He brought his grandmother, Rosa, who immediately swept Emma into her arms with the easy confidence of someone who'd raised 6 children and helped raise a dozen grandchildren. "Look at you, baby girl," Rosa crooned, "getting so big and so smart." Emma responded with a torrent of toddler babble that almost sounded like real words, reaching for Rosa's silver necklace with chubby, determined fingers. Margaret Chen arrived next, driven by her granddaughter Keisha. The 73-year-old woman moved more slowly than she had a year ago, but there was something lighter about her now, as if acknowledging the weight she'd been carrying for decades had somehow made her more buoyant, despite her age. "Victoria, dear," Margaret said, embracing her warmly. "Thank you for including us. I know Emma won't remember this party, but I will, for the rest of my life. I'll remember being welcomed into your home despite how I behaved on that airplane." "You were scared and operating from old patterns," Victoria said gently. "We all were. But you chose to grow. That matters more than where you started." Keisha carried in a beautifully wrapped present, a children's book about different kinds of families, with illustrations showing families of all races and structures. "My mom, Margaret's daughter, Rachel. She picked this out," Keisha explained. "She wanted Emma to grow up knowing that family comes in all configurations, that love transcends biology and race and all the artificial boundaries we create." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. Margaret's reconciliation with her daughter Rachel had progressed slowly but steadily over the past year. They'd had difficult conversations about the past, about racism and estrangement, and the ways that silence can be as damaging as active harm. Rachel had eventually forgiven her mother, though she'd been clear that forgiveness didn't erase consequences, that 30 years of absence couldn't be recovered, only mourned and moved past. But they were building something new. Margaret had moved from Birmingham to Atlanta to be closer to Rachel and her grandchildren. She volunteered now at a community center that served predominantly black neighborhoods, listening more than speaking, learning more than teaching. The woman who'd once reflexively suspected Marcus of being a threat now spent her afternoons tutoring black children in reading and math, trying in small ways to repair damage she'd helped perpetuate. Tyler Hayes appeared on the video screen that Victoria had set up in the living room. He couldn't travel from Connecticut due to physical therapy appointments, but he'd insisted on being part of the celebration remotely. His prosthetic leg was visible in the camera frame, a reminder of what he'd sacrificed and survived. "Happy birthday, Emma!" Tyler called out, and the toddler turned toward the screen, recognizing his voice from their regular video calls. Victoria had made sure Emma knew her Uncle Tyler, even if they couldn't be together in person as often as they'd like. "Marcus, brother," Tyler said, his face filling with emotion even through the pixelated video connection. "A year ago, you saved my niece's life. And in doing so, you saved my whole family. Victoria's reconnected with me and with Mom. Emma knows she has family who love her. All because you chose to help when you didn't have to." Marcus shook his head, uncomfortable with praise as always. "Tyler, you saved my life first. I was just returning the favor in the most indirect way possible." "That's not how this works," Tyler said firmly. "Grace isn't transactional. You didn't help Emma to settle a debt. You helped her because that's who you are. And that character, that willingness to be visible when invisibility is safer, that's what changed everything." Jessica Williams, the flight attendant, arrived with her brother David, who'd also served in Afghanistan. The siblings had grown close to Marcus over the past year, bound by shared military experience and the understanding that came with it. David and Marcus met regularly at a veterans support group in Baltimore, helping each other navigate PTSD and the complicated process of reintegration into civilian life. "Marcus tells me you're doing great work with the Community Health Initiative," David said to Victoria. 200 workers trained so far, that's incredible." Victoria smiled but shook her head. "It's a start, but we're still learning. Marcus keeps pushing us to do better, to include more community voices, to avoid the trap of wealthy people deciding what poor people need. It's uncomfortable work, but it's necessary." The doorbell rang again, and Victoria opened it to find someone she hadn't expected, James Patterson, the tech CEO who'd challenged Marcus on the airplane. He stood awkwardly on the doorstep with his son Jordan, both of them looking uncertain about their welcome. "Mr. Patterson," Victoria said, surprised but not unwelcoming. "I didn't realize you were coming." "I hope it's all right," James said, his usual confidence replaced by something more tentative. "Marcus mentioned the party when we ran into each other at Johns Hopkins last month. I know I don't have any right to be here after how I behaved. But I needed to apologize properly, and to show you something." He gestured to Jordan, who pulled out a folder from his backpack. "Dad's company has completely restructured its hiring and promotion practices," Jordan explained. "Not just diversity training, but actual systemic changes, blind resume reviews, diverse interview panels. mentorship programs for employees from underserved backgrounds, and they've hired an outside firm to audit their practices quarterly. James looked at Marcus, who'd come to the door when he heard the commotion. "Mr. Washington, I was wrong. Not just about my comments on the airplane, but about everything my company had been doing. The discrimination lawsuit we settled wasn't frivolous, it was legitimate. We had been systematically passing over qualified candidates because of unconscious bias that we refused to acknowledge." He extended his hand. "I can't undo the damage my company caused to people who deserved opportunities we denied them. But I am doing better. And that change started with watching you help a baby despite knowing you might be suspected or rejected. You taught me that courage means acting despite fear, and that comfort with inequality is just another word for complicity." Marcus shook his hand, and Victoria saw something pass between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement. Recognition that growth was possible even for people who'd spent years benefiting from systems of inequality. "Come in," Victoria said, stepping aside to let them enter. "Emma's party is for everyone who's been part of this journey, and you're part of it, whether any of us expected that or not." As the afternoon progressed, the gathering took on a quality that transcended typical birthday parties. Children played Emma with her new toys. Keisha's younger cousins who'd come along. Jordan's nephew who was visiting from college, while adults talked about harder things, about racism and reconciliation, about grief and healing, about the ways that one moment of choice can ripple outward in ways no one anticipates. Dr. Sarah Martinez arrived late, still in scrubs from her hospital shift. "Sorry," she said, embracing Victoria warmly. "Trauma surgery ran long, but I couldn't miss this." She found Marcus in the kitchen helping Rosa prepare food he'd learned to cook from his grandmother, and took genuine joy in feeding people. "Marcus, I wanted you to know something." That case with Emma, the drugging case, it led to changes in how we screen for child endangerment at San Francisco General. We're more vigilant now, more willing to ask hard questions. Because of you. We've identified 3 other cases of caregivers drugging children. 3 other Emmas who are now safe. Marcus felt the weight of that information settle in his chest. 3 children. 3 families. All because he'd chosen to help one crying baby on one airplane flight. "That's not because of me," he protested. "That's because you were paying attention, because you took the case seriously. It's because you showed us it was worth paying attention," Dr. Martinez corrected gently. "Before Emma's case, we might have chalked up the medication to parental oversight. Might not have investigated as thoroughly. But watching your care and commitment, watching you put her well-being above everything else, it raised our standard for what we should expect of ourselves." As the afternoon wore into evening, Victoria gathered everyone in the living room. Emma, exhausted from excitement and attention, dozed in Marcus's arms, her tiny hand clutching his shirt the way she had on that airplane a year ago. "I want to thank you all for being here," Victoria said, her voice steady but emotional. "A year ago, I was drowning in grief and guilt and the desperate attempt to control everything because I was terrified of feeling anything. My husband had died. My daughter was suffering. And I was failing at the most basic requirements of being human, being present, being vulnerable, being willing to trust other people." She looked at Marcus. "Marcus, You saved Emma's life, but you also saved mine. You showed me what courage actually looks like, not the absence of fear, but acting despite being afraid. Not control, but vulnerability. Not perfection, but the willingness to keep trying despite failure. She turned to Margaret. Margaret, you showed me that it's never too late to choose growth over comfort, that acknowledging our prejudices doesn't make us bad people, it makes us honest people. And that honesty is the only foundation strong enough to build real change on. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes, but said nothing, just reached for Keisha's hand and held tight. Victoria addressed the whole room now. Michael used to tell me that the measure of a life isn't what you accumulate money, success, achievements. It's what you give away, how you show up for people, how you choose connection over isolation, how you build bridges instead of walls. She picked up a framed photograph from the mantel, the security footage image of Marcus holding Emma on the airplane. The moment everything changed. This photo hangs in Hayes Pharmaceuticals headquarters now, not as a diversity trophy or corporate performance, but as a reminder of what actually matters, of what our company exists to do to heal people, regardless of their ability to pay, regardless of their race or class or any other category we use to divide each other. Victoria set the photo down and looked at her daughter, sleeping peacefully in Marcus's arms. Emma won't remember this party, won't remember the first year of her life when her father died and her mother fell apart and a stranger on an airplane became family. But I'll tell her the story. I'll tell her about the black veteran who helped her when white people suspected him, about the elderly woman who faced her own racism and chose to change, about the CEO who learned that money can't buy the things that actually matter, about the flight attendant who defended someone she didn't know because it was right. She paused, emotion threatening to overwhelm her. I'll tell her that family isn't just biology. It's the people who show up, the people who choose you and keep choosing you even when it's hard, even when it costs them something, even when the world tells them to protect themselves instead. Rosa stood up, her weathered face creased with wisdom earned through 8 decades of living as a black woman in America. "Child," she said to Victoria, "you asked Marcus what I taught him about courage. Let me tell you directly. I taught him that our ancestors survived the Middle Passage, survived slavery, survived Jim Crow and redlining and 1,000 ways this country tried to destroy us. And they survived because they helped each other, because they chose community over isolation, because they recognized that their liberation was bound up with everyone else's liberation." She moved to stand beside Marcus, placing a hand on his shoulder. "This boy right here, he carries that legacy. He chose to help your baby, not because he expected anything in return, but because that's what freedom looks like, choosing compassion even when silence is safer. And you, Victoria, you honored that choice by being willing to grow, by acknowledging your prejudice instead of defending it, by choosing his friendship even when it required you to face uncomfortable truths about yourself." Rosa looked around the room at the gathered faces, black and white, old and young, wealthy and working class, military and civilian, all brought together by one moment of crisis and choice. This is what the beloved community looks like. Not people who never make mistakes or never have prejudices, but people who are willing to grow, willing to be uncomfortable, willing to wade into water that's scary and uncertain because freedom and healing wait on the other side. Emma stirred in Marcus's arms and woke up, blinking sleepily at all the faces watching her. For a moment, she seemed confused. Too many people, too much attention. Then her gaze found her mother, and she reached out with both arms. Victoria took her daughter, holding her close and breathing in the smell of baby shampoo and birthday cake. "Happy birthday, sweet girl," she whispered. "You're so loved. By me, by your Uncle Tyler, by your Uncle Marcus, by all these people who chose to be your family." Emma patted her mother's face with sticky hands and said something that sounded remarkably like "Mama," clear and unmistakable. Her first fully articulated word. The room erupted in applause and laughter and tears. Victoria sobbed openly, clutching Emma and feeling Michael's absence and presence simultaneously, the grief that he'd never see this moment. The certainty that he'd somehow orchestrated it anyway, bringing Marcus and Emma together in that airplane cabin through a series of events too unlikely to be mere coincidence. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Marcus lingered. He'd learned over the past year that Victoria needed processing time after emotional events, needed someone to sit with her in silence while she integrated whatever had been stirred up. They sat in the living room after everyone else had gone, Emma playing quietly with a new toy on the floor between them. The Connecticut evening had turned cold, and Victoria had lit a fire in the fireplace, something she hadn't done since Michael's death, because he'd always been the one to build fires while she worked on her laptop. "Marcus," Victoria said quietly, "I need to tell you something. The Community Health Initiative is expanding to 10 more cities next year. We're investing $30 million in training community health workers, building clinics in underserved areas, and providing mobile healthcare units for rural communities." Marcus nodded, having been part of the planning for this expansion. "But that's not the important part," Victoria continued. "Victoria, the important part is why we're doing it, not as charity, not to make wealthy people feel good about themselves, but because you taught me that healthcare is a human right, not a privilege, that people who can't afford expensive doctors still deserve dignity and care, that the system is broken, and those of us with resources have a responsibility to fix it." She looked at Emma, who'd abandoned her toy in favor of trying to pull herself up on the coffee table. "I want Emma to grow up in a world where what happened on that airplane, a black man helping a white baby and being suspected for it, is unthinkable. Where people's first instinct is trust rather than fear. Where we see each other's humanity before we see categories and divisions." "That's a beautiful vision," Marcus said. "But it's going to take more than corporate initiatives to get there. It's going to take millions of individual choices every single day to see people as people rather than as threats or stereotypes or problems to be managed." Victoria nodded. "I know, but individual choices add up." Margaret choosing to call her daughter, James Patterson restructuring his company, me choosing to trust you, you choosing to help Emma. All of those individual choices create ripples, and maybe, if enough people make those choices, the ripples become waves, and the waves become transformation. Emma succeeded in pulling herself to standing, wobbling triumphantly and looking to the adults for approval. Both Victoria and Marcus applauded, and Emma beamed with pride before promptly sitting down hard on her diapered bottom. "She's so much like Michael," Victoria said softly. "Determined, fearless, convinced she can do things before she actually can." That was Michael, always reaching for the next challenge, always believing that love and effort could overcome any obstacle. She paused, then added, "He would have liked you, Marcus. would have loved that you saved Tyler's life, would have been grateful that you helped Emma, would have, her voice broke, would have been proud of me for finally letting myself grieve him instead of running from the pain. Marcus didn't say anything, just sat with her in the silence that grief required. He'd learned from his own losses his father, his nephew, the Afghan boy he couldn't save, that sometimes presence mattered more than words. After a long moment, Victoria spoke again. You know what the hardest part of grief is? It's not the sadness. I expected sadness. It's the guilt of moving forward. Every time I laugh or feel happy or forget to think about Michael for a whole day, there's this voice that says I'm betraying him, that if I really loved him, I'd stay broken forever. But staying broken doesn't honor him, Marcus said gently. Living fully honors him. Raising Emma to be brave and kind and open-hearted honors him. Building a company that helps people instead of just extracting profit honors him. You're not betraying Michael by healing. You're completing what he started, creating a life worth living. Victoria looked at Marcus with profound gratitude. How did you get so wise at 24? Trauma, Marcus said with dark humor. Nothing teaches wisdom like surviving things you thought would kill you. They sat in comfortable silence as Emma played, occasionally looking up to make sure the adults were still there. The fire crackled. Outside, Connecticut's autumn darkness settled over everything. Marcus, Victoria said eventually, I want you to be Emma's godfather, officially. I know that's traditionally a religious role, and I don't know if you're religious, but I need someone in her life who will teach her courage and compassion and the willingness to wade into water when someone needs help. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. Victoria, I'm honored, but are you sure you're not just anything? Victoria interrupted firmly. You're the person who saved my daughter's life, who taught me what real strength looks like, who shows up consistently and honestly and keeps pushing me to be better. Your family, Marcus, not by blood, but by choice. And choice is stronger than blood anyway. Emma abandoned her toy and crawled over to Marcus, pulling herself up, using his leg for support. She looked up at him with Michael's eyes and Victoria's determination and said clearly, Up! Marcus picked her up, and Emma immediately snuggled into his shoulder, humming that melody she'd learned from him. Wade in the water, the spiritual about survival and freedom, and choosing to risk the uncertain water because safety and liberation don't always coexist. Victoria watched her daughter find comfort in Marcus's arms and thought about the impossible chain of events that had brought them here. Michael's death leading to her desperate flight to San Francisco, the nanny's cancellation forcing her to bring Emma, the ear infection and drugging making Emma cry, Marcus choosing to help despite the risks, Margaret's transformation, the Tyler connection, all of it unlikely to the point of impossibility, unless you believed in something larger than coincidence, unless you believed that sometimes the universe or God or fate or whatever name you gave to the mystery put people exactly where they needed to be, exactly when they needed to be there. Marcus, Victoria said quietly, do you believe in destiny? In the idea that things happen for a reason? Marcus considered the question carefully. I don't know about destiny, but I believe in purpose. I believe we can create meaning from even the most painful circumstances, that we can choose to transform suffering into service, that we can wade into water that's scary and uncertain because we believe something better waits on the other side. He looked down at Emma, now sleeping peacefully in his arms. A year ago, this baby was crying in pain, and I had a choice. I could stay safe and invisible, or I could help and risk the consequences. I chose to help, and that choice led to this, to friendship, to family, to purpose. Not because it was destined, but because we all kept choosing connection over fear, kept choosing growth over comfort, kept choosing to see each other's humanity. Victoria nodded slowly, understanding what he meant. Destiny was too passive, too deterministic. What they'd built wasn't inevitable. It was chosen, every single day, through thousands of small decisions to show up honestly and vulnerably and courageously. Then that's what I want to teach Emma, Victoria said. Not that everything happens for a reason, but that we can create reasons, that we can build meaning and family and love from even the most broken circumstances, that we're not passive recipients of fate, but active creators of our own lives. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the Connecticut night. Somewhere out there, Margaret was learning to be a grandmother. James Patterson was restructuring his company. Tyler Hayes was completing physical therapy. Dr. Martinez was saving lives in San Francisco. Jessica Williams was diffusing tensions on airplanes. Rosa was teaching another generation about courage and community. And here, in this house that had once been a shrine to death, but was now a home for living, Victoria Hayes stood with her daughter and the man who'd saved them both not from physical death, but from the slower death of isolation and fear and the refusal to feel or connect or grow. Emma woke briefly, looked around sleepily, and whispered, "Home," before closing her eyes again. And Victoria realized that was the lesson, the gift, the transformation that had emerged from that November flight home wasn't a place. It wasn't about blood family or shared history, or any of the conventional markers people use to define belonging. Home was the people who showed up, who chose you and kept choosing you, who waded into uncertain water because you needed help, who taught you courage through their example and grace through their forgiveness and love through their persistence. Home was this, a CEO and a veteran and a baby, bound together by crisis and choice and the slow work of healing. Different races, different backgrounds, different stories, but united by something stronger than all their differences, the willingness to see each other's humanity and respond with compassion instead of fear. Outside, the Connecticut night deepened toward winter. Inside, a fire burned warm and bright, and three people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances sat together in the peaceful silence of belonging. The crying had stopped long ago. What remained was love, complicated, hard-won, chosen love that transcended every boundary society used to keep people separate. And in the arms of the man who'd first shown her what safety felt like, Emma Hayes slept peacefully.
dreaming whatever dreams 18-month-old babies dream, surrounded by a family that had chosen her and each other in the face of every reason not to.
That was the unthinkable thing.
After all, not that a black veteran had helped a white baby on an airplane, but that one moment of courage and compassion could ripple outward to transform so many lives. The unthinkable thing was that love, real love, was always possible if people chose it over fear. And they had chosen, were still choosing, would keep choosing for whatever time they had left in this world. That was enough. That was everything. That was home. Message to audience. 200 words. If you're between 55 and 68, you remember a different America one, where neighbors knew each other's names, where a handshake meant something, where we judged people by their character, not their category, but somewhere along the way. We forgot those lessons. We built walls instead of bridges. We chose comfort over courage. We stayed silent when we should have spoken up. This story isn't about a hero on an airplane. It's about all of us. It's about the grandmother who finally admitted she was wrong after 72 years. It's about the CEO who learned that money can't buy the things that matter. It's about the veteran who chose visibility over safety because a baby needed help. And it's about everyday people choosing growth over comfort, connection over fear, love over prejudice. Your generation marched for civil rights, protested wars, changed the world, but the work isn't finished. Every day. You have a choice: stay comfortable in your assumptions, or wade into uncertain water because someone needs help. Your grandchildren are watching. What legacy will you leave them? Will it be fear and division, or will it be the courage to see each other's humanity and respond with love? Engagement questions. Have you ever had a moment like Marcus and Victoria where someone from a different background taught you something that changed how you see the world? When was the last time you chose courage over comfort, even when it cost you something? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Let's build a community of people committed to choosing connection over fear. Comment now and let us know. What small act of courage will you choose this week?